What happened to Soul Eater's art style? Atsushi Ohkubo's art style is one of the most iconic in manga, and it's part of why Soul Eater still has a dedicated fanbase more than 10 years after its final chapter. But as I'm sure you know, Ohkubo's later work Fire Force looks a bit different. As a matter of fact, the later chapters of Soul Eater clearly look different than the earlier chapters. But if I asked you what changed, you might not be able to point out exactly why it looks different. So in this video, I'm going to analyze each of the artistic choices made by Ohkubo throughout Soul Eater, discuss the artistic evolution of this manga, and explain why some people still think it's the best looking manga to this day. Now, before I start, I do have a few disclaimers. First of all, as this will cover the entire story, this will probably contain some spoilers. However, I will only be covering the main storyline, so this video will not get into any of the content in Soul Eater Not. Finally, as I'm only concerned with the manga, this video will not look at the anime or any of the choices made by Studio Bones. With all of that out of the way, let's get into the first stage of Soul Eater's artistic evolution. The first stage, which I refer to as the beginning of Soul Eater, starts with the 3 one-shots and ends right around chapter 15. Now, as a brand new Soul Eater fan, I was a bit shocked to see what Soul Eater looked like in the beginning. As I'm sure most people will agree, it's clearly distinct from the iconic look it would achieve later on. For example, the line work is pretty thin. I think most people would associate Ohkubo with bolder outlines, but in this early stage, almost all of the line work is thin. It works in his favor though, because at this point in the story, the characters seem somewhat unpolished. So for example, the eyes are pretty far apart. And while you can argue that it's up to preference, I just think it looks goofy. But because the line work isn't as clearly defined, the unpolished nature of the characters doesn't stand out as much. If it had been, it would have been much more noticeable. Now aside from that, I actually really like the art style early on. Granted, I think it's clear that Ohkubo was still growing as an artist, but I mean, you can't deny that his early stuff looks a lot better than a lot of veteran artists. For example, his scenery and backgrounds are amazing. Obviously, they're very detailed and they have that spooky vibe to them. But on top of the attention to detail, he's also really good about perspective. He doesn't just place the characters in front of a cool looking background, he also bends and twists the background around the characters. This way you can appreciate the backgrounds, but they also serve a purpose beyond just filling space. In this case, they draw our attention to the characters. Another twist on this is of course the iconic sun and moon. Now I know people like to make 30-page dissertations on why you're wrong about the moon in Soul Eater, but my take is much simpler. Basically, Ohkubo uses the sun and the moon to set the tone. So for example, later in the series when the characters are in the desert, the sun looks like it's on crack. But if it's first thing in the morning, then the sun will look kinda tired. Or if you're in one of those scenes where the madness is taking over, you'll see the moon and it'll be bleeding tears and look batshit crazy. It's just a really cool way of adding to whatever the tone is in each scene, and it's kind of become Ohkubo's calling card because of it. And of course, one of his other signature skills is his character designs. But before I say more on that, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. So one thing I didn't appreciate until I went back is that Ohkubo's characters have actual shading. I know this sounds like a dumb thing to say, but I have a challenge for you. Take a look at most of your favorite shonen manga, and list how often the characters get actual shading. It's not that often, and it's why a lot of other manga look flat. Meanwhile, Soul Eater does it all the time, and it just makes the characters look that much better. Another thing that contributes to the characters is how they're shaped. The best word I can come up with to describe them is stylized. If anything, I would say cartoonish. But not to say they're oversimplified or really over the top, but it's a lot of bold shapes. So big spiky hair or long arms and lots of curves. It's kind of in between something like Jujutsu Kaisen, where the characters are very polygonal, and something like Dragon Ball, where almost everything is rounded out. Again, it's just stylized. One last thing I'll point out before I move on, and this is true for the whole series, but it stands out right away. Ohkubo is really good at making memorable character designs. I mean, there are plenty of series like AOT with great characters, but it takes me 5 volumes just to remember their names. Soul Eater, totally different. The ninja kid with the spiky hair? That's Black Star. The son of Death with the white streaks in his hair and the guns? That's Death the Kid. Even someone like Maka, who's supposed to be boring, stands out because of her design. Her formal sport coat is contrasted by the crazy long coattail that makes it more like a battlesuit. She's got the pigtails that make her look like a little girl, but then she goes around with a giant scythe. It's a perfect balance of textbook schoolgirl, but also badass main character energy, and it makes her and all of the other characters instantly recognizable, something that very few mangaka do as well as Oukubo. On that note, let's move on to stage 2. The second stage, which I refer to as Early Soul Eater, starts with chapter 16 and ends right around chapter 45. In other words, it starts right around the Big Bash and ends right before the raid. In my opinion, this is where the biggest shift in the art style takes place. As you'll notice, this is where Oukubo shifts away from the more unpolished look in the beginning and defines what his art style ultimately looks like. Most of the changes later on really just add to what takes place in this stage. For example, the paneling and action really go off in this stage. Not that they didn't before, in fact, they're really good in the beginning. But as you can see, Oukubo takes it to a new level in the Big Bash arc as we see some of the biggest fights in the series so far, and it kinda raises the bar for the rest of the story. One change I noticed when I went back, however, was the amount of blank panels. In the beginning, there aren't very many blank panels, but when you get into Early Soul Eater, you see noticeably more of them. It's not a bad thing per se. In fact, it was probably only a matter of time when you consider how much time it saves Oukubo. But still, it was kinda cool that Oukubo did as much background work as he did in the previous stage. But it works, as the characters look great and obviously the paneling and action look great. Speaking of characters, let's talk about how characters look in this stage. Thankfully, now the characters' eyes aren't 5 feet apart. That's always a good start. There tends to be less character shading than before, not by a drastic amount, but it is noticeable. Again, I just think that's a time management thing, but I could be wrong. In any event, it doesn't take away from character designs in any major way, at least not in this stage. Characters also seem more rounded out in this stage. So for example, you take a look at chapter 23, and you see this panel of the characters playing basketball. You don't really see any sharp angles or shapes in their designs at all. It's mostly just curves, rounded out shapes, and long limbs. This is also true for new characters like Justin Law and Marie, but this isn't always the case. Once you get to fights or more intense scenes later on, Oukubo will switch it up and use more angular character designs. As a matter of fact, this kind of becomes another calling card of his from this point on. For example, he would continue to do this in Fire Force, with lots of casual scenes filled with chibi-like characters, and then crazy-looking characters in more serious scenes. Speaking of crazy, one other thing worth mentioning in this stage is how unhinged some of the characters get, particularly in the scenes when characters are facing off against the madness. So for example, you have the scene where Eruka is hallucinating and it looks like Ashura is eating her face. And then you have the fight between Stein and Medusa where Stein goes completely bonkers. Oukubo is generally really good at bending characters to whatever he's trying to do. But the best of it takes place in scenes like this, and it's at this point where we really get to see just what that looks like. But having said that, let's move on to the third stage. Stage 3, which is what I call the raid, starts with chapter 46 and ends right around chapter 81. Now, as you'll soon find out, this stage and the next one will be pretty straightforward, mainly because the art style doesn't change all that much from this point on. I will note that, in fact, this is definitely my favorite stage, and that is because it takes all of the stuff that worked great in early Soul Eater and just tunes it. So for example, line work is generally bolder in this stage. So before, you needed that thinner line work because the art kinda looked rough. But now that Oukubo has a lot more experience, he can afford to draw those nice, thick outlines and really highlight the characters. Another thing to keep in mind is that he's still doing those blank backgrounds here and there, so you could argue it's a shift in detail. One other change you'll notice is that characters have longer faces now. So if you bring up that basketball panel again, you can see how the characters' heads are almost shaped like circles. But in this third stage, they look more like ovals. It's partly why I think that it's at this stage that Oukubo comes to define what is his true art style. Another reason for this is just how stylized the art gets. And nothing illustrates this point better than Chapter 57, the climax of the fight between Black Star and Mifune, my favorite fight in the entire series. First off, you look at Mifune in this fight, and he looks way better than when we first met him in the Black Star one-shot. He's much more polished, but he's also this mix of long hair and limbs, but plenty of angles and sharp shapes as well. It's something like this that I think is like the definitive Ohkubo aesthetic. But then you look at this chapter, and it's just very stylized. You have Black Star's crazy new power, where he looks like he's got this like paintbrush stroke coming off of him, and then you get to this gorgeous double spread right here, where the two characters clash, and it's got all of this gritty, sketchy detail, and it's nothing short of perfect. It's scenes like this that capture everything great about Ohkubo's art style, and I think it's why this is the peak of Soul Eater's art. But we do still have one more stage. The final stage, or just the end of Soul Eater, starts around chapter 82 and continues right up until chapter 113. Now, I almost don't think it constitutes getting its own thing. I was looking at these later chapters and really struggling to point out exact differences between this and the previous stage. But at the same time, I can't help looking at the characters in these final chapters and feeling like they clearly look different. Like, for example, here's a panel of Kid from the raid. Okay, so now here's a panel of Kid on the battle on the moon. I know it's not drastically different, but there's definitely enough of a difference to notice it. To me, it seems like this is kind of where Ohkubo starts to use his more modern style of character design. So for example, I can't tell you why, but something about the eyes seems different. I thought maybe they're a bit bigger, but I'm not sure. One thing he definitely does different is jawlines, as they're like these round blades. So it'll be one long curve that comes to a sharp point where the chin is. I also feel like the outlines are slightly bolder in this stage, but again, I'm not sure. Like I said, I struggled to distinguish this stage from the last one, but because I felt like it was different and because I know people like to bring up Ohkubo's new art versus his old stuff, I thought it was only fair to present my case. By all means, if you've noticed anything else, then let me know. But on that note, I'd like to recap everything we talked about and offer some final thoughts. So one obvious shift is in the overall quality of character designs. Ohkubo's art was a bit amateurish in the beginning, but quickly turned up in the early chapters. Along with that, his line work gets bolder over time, making his characters and other details really stand out. He has a simple approach to character designs, but everything is so stylized that it doesn't look oversimplified. Plus, he puts so much detail in the action and backgrounds that it always works out. He adds more blank panels as time goes on, but the backgrounds he does draw never fall off. I just love the overall aesthetic of Soul Eater. Obviously, people love all the spooky, gothic stuff. But for me, it's I don't even know what to call it. For a lack of words, Soul Eater has this urban style to it. It's a very 2000s manga, and you can see that in every chapter, from the way he draws graffiti, the way he dresses up the characters, even the color pages where he shades characters with these like Tetris pieces. Like I mentioned before, I also think Ohkubo is a genius when it comes to fight scenes. And a big part of that is, like I mentioned with the unhinged stuff, he really just knows how to bend and shape characters in ways that are really expressive. Finally, Ohkubo is one of the best artists when it comes to character designs. I already said this before, but it cannot be understated just how memorable and iconic his characters are, especially in Soul Eater. So for that reason, and like a billion more, Soul Eater has quickly become one of my all-time favorite manga. But what do you think? How would you describe Soul Eater's evolution? How would you compare its art style to other manga? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, then check out my video on Jujutsu Kaisen. In that video, I talk about Jujutsu Kaisen's artistic evolution. You can find that video in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.